This weekend, I've been continuing to work on the Realms of Solace questing rules as I shelter in place with this ongoing COVID-19 pandemic situation. But I'm getting a little stir crazy, and I started digging through the archives today and just looking at all the different iterations that I've gone through with this game. And I thought it might be kind of interesting to just kind of take a spin through the game design graveyard. My game design process is all over the place. It's totally random. I'm basically just figuring everything out by trial and error. And what I realized today was the very first version of this game that I found in my archives is from 2016. So, I've basically I thought I'd been working on this for a couple of years. I've actually been working on Realms of Solace for 4 years now, which is crazy. But this was the very first version of the game that I came up with, and it's basically the idea I had was that it was a little pocketbook. Like this whole thing was like 4 by 6 inches and could just fit in your pocket, so you could play it at coffee shops. And the rules have changed quite a bit since I wrote the first version, but a lot of the basic mechanics are still the same. And all the art was placeholder art, just like old paintings I did like 20 years ago. I just kind of threw them in there and was like, I guess those will work. But basically, yeah, it was a 6d6 system where you're chucking 6 dice on a hex map. And I think there's something to be said for this pocket version. And when I finish this magazine format version of Realms of Solace, I think I'm actually going to go through and make a pocket version of it. The exact same rule set, but just formatted completely different, so that you could potentially like put this game in your pocket and go to a coffee shop, or maybe on your lunch break at work, bust it out and build a realm. But the big thing with this first version is I actually finished the mapping rules, but then really got stuck. I couldn't figure out how to actually make a game out of it. It was a really cool little map building kit, but I couldn't figure out really how to implement quests or delving or anything like that. So I ended up shelving the project. I thought about releasing it just as like a map drawing tool, but then I was like, no, I think there's more to this game, and I need to just kind of sit on it. And then I sat on it for a really long time. But these are some of the really old maps that I generated, and some of these maps have a real sort of simple, minimalist, iconic vibe. And as you can see, the hex grid had like numbers and letters to indicate the position, because there was a little lookup table. If you didn't have dice, you could just plop your hand down on the back page, which was like a little lookup chart, and then you basically the lookup table had corresponding letters and numbers, so you didn't even need dice to play the game. Because I figured, like, if you're at a coffee shop, maybe you're too self-conscious to roll dice. But I think some of the maps that I generated with this first version were pretty cool. Like, there's some interesting things going on, and maybe some rules that got kind of pushed to the wayside along the way that I may incorporate into the game after looking at this first version. But I went through like many playtests of this game to try to get the balance right. And just going back through some of these old maps. Some of them are really simple. Some of them I went back and shaded in and tried to make them all pretty. Like, I was just trying to figure out. So this is the lookup chart I was talking about. So instead of rolling 6 dice, you could just go plop and then just look where each finger is. Oh, that's a 2, that's a 5, that's a 2, It was just a really easy way to roll dice without dice. Oh, I just rolled a 4. And then here, do the same thing, like pop, and like, oh, that's hex F12, that's hex F6. So I will probably include something like this in the final magazine version that I'm working on now, just because why not? It's free. And I like the idea that there are multiple ways to get the job done. Like, you don't actually have to like carry around a bunch of dice with you. I rolled up a ton of maps when I was trying to play balance this thing way back when I first started working on it. Here was a version that actually had like different climate zones. So there was an Arctic zone, a temperate zone, and a tropical zone. That did not make it into the final, but I could add that as an optional advanced rule. I was trying to figure out like how to label my hex system. A lot of these old maps are really kind of interesting to look at and remind me why I set out to build this game in the first place. This is one of the very first maps that I generated 4 years ago, and here I was even like just jotting down random rules. This was my terrain lookup table. If I rolled a 1, it would be a swamp or a bog, forest, hills, mountains, high mountains. I hadn't even come up with the idea of dark powers yet. Actually, there is one over here. Yeah, who knows? But, here I was coming up with like wind directions and different tables for different terrain types. So there were some pretty wonky maps that got created with the original rules. But all the rules that exist in the game now exist to fix problems that I was seeing in some of the early maps. So there's kind of a logic behind how it all went down. And then here I started working on maps that were bigger than the original pocket size, and I was like, wow, I really like the bigger maps. I like the larger format. I like having a little more real estate. It's easier to draw, it's easier to label things. And then I started to second guess my idea of making this a pocketbook. But that was right about the time that I shelved it. And then I put it away for a really long time. And then I was like, well, maybe roll and write's not the way to go. Like maybe I should have like a tile laying game, because a lot of people don't like to draw, and that's going to turn people off. So then I was like, yeah, I should make a board game with tiles, kind of like Mage Knight or Magic Realm. Neither of which I had even played at the time, but I just really liked the idea of modular game boards. So then I started designing like all these different ideas for hex tiles, and I was like, well, maybe each hex tile is composed of several smaller hexes, and I tried to think like is top down best for this kind of stuff, or more of a frontal view. But then if it's frontal view and you rotate the hexes, then it's going to be like a different perspective from each hex, and the board's going to look kind of wonky. So I was like struggling with all these design issues, top down versus perspective, but it was sort of top down, but like slightly tilted, kind of like a ortho camera, not an actual perspective camera, but it was kind of clean. And the stuff didn't look too bad if you were rotating tiles around. And then I was like, yeah, I'm going to build a tile-based game. And then I kind of put it on hold for a while again. And then after a really long hiatus and just kind of going in circles for years about game design, I started thinking about like, well, what if it was, board games are complicated, board games are expensive to produce. Board games, you have to basically like manufacture 1,000 copies of it, and then you have a garage full of board games, and you have like failed Kickstarter, and it just seemed like a nightmare. And then I was kind of like, well, what if I just designed a card game? Then you don't have to draw, you don't have to produce an entire huge board game, but card games are actually fairly inexpensive to manufacture, and they're very small. So if you have 1,000 copies of it sitting around in your garage, it's not going to take up the whole garage, and they're pretty inexpensive to ship. And then I was like, so then I started designing this idea that like, okay, well, the whole game is basically a set of tarot cards, and it's a hex grid game on tarot cards, tarot sized cards, and it's all modular, and they're, some of the tiles have roads, and you can connect tiles that have roads to other tiles that have roads, and blah, blah, blah. And I really started digging this idea. And I think this still has potential, but I just kind of like, I don't know, I was just running into weird little caveats with it, and it just wasn't quite looking or feeling the way. And I showed it to a few friends, and nobody was super excited about the tarot card, like the look of the tarot cards. And I was even like a little on the fence about it. And so then I was like, they really liked this other this other system where I just had these large hex tiles. And I think this system has promise, but once again, now we're kind of getting back into board game territory, like little meeples, and then I'm back into like board game design territory. And I was like, yeah, I don't know, board games just seem a little too crazy. And one other version was like, well, what if it was just literally a board game? Like, what if there were just 4 sections that you could rearrange in any order? I think around this time I was starting to play Runebound 3rd edition, and I was kind of getting into the idea of like, well, it's kind of a static world, and the real gameplay isn't about building a world, it's about the adventure that happens in the world. And this actually appealed to me and still does. I found that with even 4 tiles, you can create some pretty interesting, pretty unique play spaces, and you can get some pretty interesting road configurations, and it just sort of works. And if you printed these double-sided, I think you would have a lot of replayability with just 4 8x8-inch boards. So that's something that I still think about and still knock around, and it's still a potential future idea. But so we've got our big board tiles, we've got our hex tiles, we've got our tarot cards. It was around this time that I started playing Magic Realm, and I love Magic Realm, but I was always a little lukewarm on the art. So then I just started designing my own tile set for Magic Realm, and I just wanted it to be more vibrant. I wanted it to be a little more like, I wanted it just to read a little more modern, a little more fresh. I was coming up with my own character cards, with my own art for Magic Realm, and I was like, well, what if I just reskinned Magic Realm? I would end up with a ton of assets. I could share those with the community, with the Magic Realm community, and they'd be welcome to use them if they wanted. But then also I could repurpose all the assets that I created for my reskin of Magic Realm to basically create my own game with and finish Realms of Solace. And I was like kind of using Magic Realm as sort of a catalyst and a springboard for finishing Realms of Solace. So now I've got this like huge stack. The graveyard's getting bigger. And then I was like, okay, seriously, like I need to come up with a plan. What is the dead simplest solution? And then I was kind of back to the idea of cards, because a simple card game would definitely be like exponentially cheaper than a board game to make and try to distribute. And so then I was coming up with like this idea. Once again, I was sort of tinkering with this idea for these like playing card sized tiles instead of the tarot card sized tiles, just to like really simplify. And so then I was like, well, what if I just have these like tiny little 1-inch tiles? Now we're almost back to like 1980s magazine game stuff here with like the counter sheets. I mean, this version of Realms of Solace was basically just like Citadel of Blood, the Ares magazine game, but with like modular hex tiles, and it was more of a realm crawl instead of a dungeon crawl. And I think this has a lot of potential too. And then I started looking into like the cost of manufacturing these little 1-inch tiles, and it's not super cheap. And then you have to like kind of box it up, and I don't know. As you can see, I just can't commit to anything, and I spend an enormous amount of time like prototyping and building like 1,000 different variations of this sort of realm crawl dungeon delving game that I've always wanted to design, and just can't really nail it. This was another version I did that was like, I got feedback on this one from a couple friends who thought it was cool, but just like way too small and hard to read. So I did these like much bigger, like 2-inch tiles, and I did really kind of, I think I like the art a lot better. I feel like this was promising too. I mean, this reads well to me, and I think it's like, this is a really good size for maybe having meeples that move from hex to hex. This version was a little too small, and this version was just like a little too ugly. but I think these 2-inch hex tiles were really kind of like a good compromise. But once again, just like straying like way too far into board game territory. And then I was kind of like, well, you know what? Like, I don't really care anymore about mass production. Like, all I really want to do is create like an art object. Like, I want to build a game that, like, maybe I just custom build them. Like, I just take orders and build them to order. And maybe I build them out of wood. And maybe I only ever make like 100 copies of the game. So that's when I started thinking about the game as less of a mass-produced game and more of like a boutique art game that only maybe 100 people would ever own, and which is kind of a crazy notion. But I started prototyping this in foam core because I wanted like the 3-dimensionality. But the idea was like the final product, I would actually make it out in my wood shop, and I would just take orders and build them one by one, which I think would have been time prohibitive. I can't even imagine how I would have pulled that off, but that's just kind of like the kind of thought process I go through. And this really gets like really close back to Realms of Solace. I was like, well, what if it was basically like the Realms of Solace rule set? But you know, you've got these like wooden components, and instead of drawing all the terrain types on the hexes, you're actually just building, you're building this all out. And I kind of had a lot of fun with this. I even did some like basic gameplay testing with this whole idea. And there was even, there's a little bit of everything. There's the ability to build these little islands and put little mountains on them, and I even use these little Legos as like temporary meeples. And this was actually taking shape and kind of getting exciting. Like, wow, I could see people playing this. I could see people like getting into kind of a 3-dimensional little art board game. So then I bought a really cheap 3D printer. It's a Solace 3D, which only has like a 6-inch print bed. So I could only build this in small pieces. But I built these like, I was basically modeling my 3D version off of this foam core version that I built. There's a learning curve with the 3D modeling, but I figured out how to come up with like a modular hex tile system. And I gotta say, like, it worked pretty well. The downside is, so the upside is, it's really not that expensive to print this stuff. The PLA filament that I use is actually relatively inexpensive. I mean, I think each of these pieces costs like a few cents to print, but time consuming. That was the downside to this method, is that it's actually fairly time consuming to print this stuff. It's been a while since I've printed, but I think like this, this was like this took 30 minutes. These big C plates took like over 4 hours each, I think, to print. So it's tedious, but building this stuff out of wood would have been just as tedious. So I was also wrestling with like, well, should I use like these end caps? Like how sophisticated should I go with this stuff? And then I built these little kingdoms that could snap on. I think for crops, for farmland, I had these little like textural end caps that you could put down for farmland, little sailboats for adventuring. But the whole thing was really just kind of a rabbit hole. The more I got into it, the more I was like, wow, this could consume an enormous amount of time, and I'm not really sure where it's all leading. I was like, well, forests can have their like own special texture. For the dark powers, I even like printed these like black caps. They would sort of represent the reach of the dark power. And the Dark Tower itself would be this like kind of menacing black tower. So this whole thing was kind of cool. It felt simultaneously like some sort of weird Legoland playset, but also sort of a war game. Basically, injection molding something like this gets very expensive. You have to print thousands of copies to make it worth it, and then I'm back to the situation of having like a garage full of huge boxes of plastic that nobody wants to buy. So eventually, my lack of business know-how kind of scared me away from this idea, but I think it had a lot of promise. I think it was a really fun prototype, and it was fun to learn how to 3D print at home. And it was fun to figure out like how to take all these different paper ideas I had and build them into 3D, and then actually build them into a plastic. And then after 4 years of tinkering around with like all these different ideas, I finally came full circle and came back to the idea that like, you know what this really needs to be is just a very simple set of rules that anybody can print out on a home printer or at the print shop. And I think it just needs to be a roll and write game. I feel like we're living in a time now where board games are getting bigger and bigger, and everybody is collecting more and more boxes of plastic. And it's just, and I think as cool as that is, like, I love that. I love board games. I kind of just want to represent like an alternative to that right now. I want to just go as lo-fi as possible. And it's like, you know what? You got a few dice, you got a really lightweight rule set, and you can have hours of fun with it. So I think that's my goal now. This was all really fun. It was all great art experiment, game design experiment. But at the end of the day, I think a solid set of simple rules can be just as immersive as any one of these products that took countless hours of my time to prototype. So that's it. That's my game design graveyard. Long story short, I think it's all about the journey. I've always loved prototyping games more than I've loved finishing them, apparently. I give myself an A for prototyping and a D- on follow through. So, but this Realms of Solace is nearing completion now, despite all the different experiments and exercises that I had to go through with the board games and the tile-based games and the card games. I think all that was necessary for me to figure out that what I really wanted to build at the end of the day was a very simple, basically free, I think I'm going to give it away on Drive-Thru RPG, little roll, write, and draw game that anybody can pick up and play. And it kind of forces you to participate and to use your own imagination and let the adventure happen in your own mind's eye.